This presentation deals with maintenance, repair, and standard unit provisions of the legislation, how these have changed, and how they will be changing, so that you can start thinking about whether your declaration or bylaws will need to be changed in the future, or if there are changes you might make in anticipation of these amendments that will sometime come into force. I'm going to approach this from three different ways. I'm going to talk about the definitions of maintenance and repair, I'm going to talk about the application of those definitions, and I want to talk briefly about how the standard unit has changed. First, back in the 1970s, we had virtually a non-definition. All that the Act told us is that the obligation to repair after damage and the obligation to maintain are mutually exclusive. And we were told that the obligation to repair after damage in relation to a unit does not include improvements made to the units if those improvements were made after registration of the declaration and description. This virtual non-definition remained in place for the next 2 decades. When the Condominium Act 1998 was finally contemplated, a little more clarity was added. It was clarified that the obligation to repair after damage includes the obligation to repair and replace after damage or failure, but not the obligation to repair after normal wear and tear. This was identified as being part of the obligation to maintain. The Act also continued the provision that the obligation to repair after damage did not include repairing improvements made to a unit, but took away the provision that said those improvements had to have been made after the declaration and description were registered. This slide more or less summarizes what I just described, and this slide shows us what the changes are going to be under the new amendments to the Act. First of all, and significantly, the phrase repair after damage will no longer be part of the legislation. Instead, we will only refer to repair, and repair will be the catch-all that the word sounds like to include repair or replacement after normal wear and tear, damage, or failure. You can see immediately a major change here. Normal wear and tear repairs are no longer part of the obligation to maintain. This could significantly impact the interpretation of maintenance and repair obligations as they're currently set out in your declarations, and will require you to at least turn your mind to whether some amendments need to be made to preserve the status quo or to make such changes as are desirable. So now we'll talk about how the Act applies these definitions. What the condo does, what the owner does. Since the 1970s, the condo has had to repair the units and the common elements after damage and to maintain the common elements, and the owner's only obligation is to maintain the units, subject to any changes that are made in the declaration. The Act allowed that the condominium could be made to maintain the units, and the owner could be made to repair the units and to maintain common elements or any part of them. In the next couple of decades legislation, nothing significant changed except that owners could be made then to repair common elements that were designated for their exclusive use. They couldn't be made to repair other common elements, and that's an error that appears in many old declarations, but they could be made to repair exclusive use common elements. Under the 1998 Act, these provisions were preserved almost exactly as written, except that they clarified that when the condo has the obligation to maintain a unit, it could be to maintain the whole or any part of a unit. So how are these things changing? Well, first of all, we've already said the repair after damage phrase is gone. But a significant change is that where the condo used to have the default obligation to repair the units, that will now be the owner's default obligation. The fact is that won't require a lot of changes to many declarations because they already state that the owner has to repair the unit, but where they don't, this is a change. And so particularly some older declarations will need to be reviewed to ensure that, again, the status quo obligations remain as they should be, or that things only change in a way that you want them to. The other major changes here are that, of course, the condo can be made to repair units or any part of them under the declaration, and the owner can now be made to repair any of the common elements, not just the exclusive use common elements. In addition, the new legislation will provide that there could be other repair and maintenance obligations, whatever those might be, that could be prescribed in the regulations, which could change everything. It's going to leave a lot of things up in the air, but also create a lot of flexibility for future development. And here's another point to keep in mind. One of the other changes coming into the Act has to do with the reserve fund. The reserve fund will now be used not only for major repair of common elements and assets, but for major repair of anything that the condominium corporation is obligated to repair. So if the condominium is obligated to repair the unit or any part of it, then that will also fall within the range of the reserve fund and reserve fund planning. That's a more major change to be discussed later. Now, as for the standard unit, I'll try to be brief. The standard unit definition concept was created in the 1998 Act for the purpose of defining what an improvement to a unit is. It applies to only two topics: repair after damage of the units and insurance of the units. In both cases, it serves to restrict or limit those obligations so that they only apply to what is defined as standard in the standard unit definition and not to those components of a unit that are defined as improvements in that definition. The pending amendments to the Act change two things. First of all, the standard unit definition will no longer apply to repairs to a unit. So if you have the repair obligation, it will apply to the whole of a unit, both improvements and standard components alike, unless, of course, they do something in the regulations to limit it again. The standard unit definition will continue to apply to insurance and to limit that obligation to just improvements. And the other change is that there will be new definitions of what is an improvement and what is a standard unit that don't change a great deal, but they do change a little. An improvement is, of course, whatever is not defined as standard in a standard unit definition, but it will also include repairs or modifications to standard components if they use materials higher in quality than the original as determined by reference to current construction standards at the time. The standard unit definition is currently that which is found in a bylaw of the condominium or in a schedule provided by the declarant on turnover. That schedule is no longer going to be relevant unless, of course, they put something in the regulations to bring it back into play. When the amendments come into place, the standard unit will be what is described in a bylaw of the corporation or what is prescribed by the regulations under the Act. So if you don't put your own standard unit definition in place, then the legislation is going to put one in place for you. And that concludes this seminar, a little bit longer than I intended it to be. Maintenance, repair, and the standard unit. A lot of fun work for lawyers in the future. My apologies in advance to the condominiums that have to pay for it.